Hannah Murray on TRE in the afternoon.
Joining us on the line now is Moira Allen, who fell in love with Victorian magazines whilst living in England in 2007. Since then, she's collected hundreds of Victorian annuals. Her new book, How to Survive in Victorian Britain, enables readers to explore what Victorians thought and did and debunks many common myths about Victorian life. Welcome to the show, Moira.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Oh, it's lovely to have you with us. And wow, this sounds fascinating. So what first attracted you or made it interesting to you about Victorian Britain?
Well, of course, going over to Britain, your used bookstores are just amazing. I mean, you can go in there and you can find a magazine that was published 150 years ago, which you can't really do in America. And what first really got my attention, I love the artwork and the beautiful engravings and line drawings. So that was why I started picking up the magazines. But then, of course, I started reading the articles and found that if you really wanted to see how they lived, these magazines are full of articles on how to cook and clean and manage the servants and manage your household and keep a budget and all that sort of thing. And I majored in anthropology in college, so this was kind of like having an anthropological tour of the Victorian era.
Yeah, amazing. So was it quite difficult or easy after all the research and reading that you did to imagine what it would have been like to live then?
I thought it would be easy, and then I kept finding, here's this that you need to look up and that you need to look up and all the little things that I didn't know to kind of connect the dots. But you get kind of a big picture when you start reading, especially the women's magazines, because those are the ones that are aimed at how to live your best life as a Victorian woman. I mean, they're very similar to our women's magazines today. And so getting that kind of the big picture, getting the feeling like, okay, if I were a woman living in Victorian times, these would tell me everything I needed to know to manage my home and or get a job or get an education or anything I wanted to do.
Interesting. So what kind of things did you see in these magazines? What was it like to live as a woman in Victorian times then?
Well, it wasn't as horrible as a lot of articles would like us to believe. I mean, you really hear today that Victorian women had no rights and they were confined to their homes and, did nothing but housework and all that kind of thing. And one of the things that really surprised me reading some of these magazines is, I mean, you get this picture of a Victorian woman kind of sitting in her parlor doing needlework, and that was just kind of the only thing that she did. And one of the magazines that is my personal favorite is called The Girl's Own Paper. And it started out kind of, they didn't quite know what they were going to do, but then they became more and more focused on surprisingly independent women. And they were talking about crafts that a woman could engage in. And it would be things like metalwork and blacksmithing and making pottery. And I'm going, this is not the Victorian woman that I pictured just sitting there doing embroidery all day.
Yeah, absolutely. So were you really surprised with a lot of the things and articles that you came across?
I was very surprised. And these same magazines, they would be full of articles about history and archaeology and something. Now, they would always have little titles like Politics for Girls. So you're kind of like, yeah, okay. But then if you think about it in our own society, I mean, we didn't start really complaining about calling women girls until the 1970s. And so you kind of have to realize that went on for a long, long time. But there is a certain amount of frequently a bit of condescension there of, well, your brain probably isn't quite big enough to really grasp this, so we'll just present it in this very cute little chat dialogue tone of a lot of these articles would have sort of some older person talking with fictional young people, and you'd have your young person like Mary say, well, explain to me how the Bank of England works. Well, Mary, let me tell you, it does this and it does that.
Yeah. And obviously now that kind of language wouldn't fly at all, and people would be very offended by it. Were women offended by it at the time, do you think, or was it just normal?
I think to a certain degree, it was normal, but it phases out. I mean, you see that in the 1880s, and you really don't see it quite so much in the 1890s. You do see it some, but there's much more of a sense as time goes on that women are being treated as mature adults in their own right, and that they don't have to be talked down to like children. And of course, a lot of the writing is being done by women. That was another thing that surprised me is, we've all seen the movie or read the book about the intrepid girl reporter who is going to crack the bastions of male newspapers and so on and so forth. This is usually around the turn of the century, and she meets all kinds of opposition, but she's going to hang in there and be the first female reporter. Women were reporters from the 1860s.
Wow.
So, this whole women in the newsroom being a new thing at the turn of the century, it was not new. Women were reporting during the American Civil War.
And they were writing under women's names as well?
Under women's names, yes. It really surprised me to, in fact, when I first was really getting into this, I remember sitting down and going over one of the magazines and just making a list of how many women's names did I see as authors versus men's names, and then there's a lot that you can't identify because they're just initials.
Yeah.
And was finding that at least a third of the articles, at least in the women's magazines, were written by women.
That's amazing.
Now, when you get into the more general interest magazines like The Strand and Pearson's and magazines like that, then you see a higher number of male authors to female authors, but there's still quite a few.
Yeah. So why is it, do you think, then it was more important with books and literature that women were hiding behind male names for much of that time?
Well, I don't know. I can't tell you when that began to change. Obviously, earlier in the period, at least this is what we're told, that people, publishers wouldn't publish books by women. I don't know if that is true or not, but certainly some of the earliest novels were written by women, and I'm talking about back in, say, the 1830s, 1840s, because novels were controversial at that point. It was, you were not improving your mind by reading a novel, but there were a number of novels written by women even at that time, and as you go on further into the 19th century, literature just explodes, and it becomes an avenue, too, for women to actually make a living, that it's acceptable to be a writer.
Wow. And in terms of life and living, we've obviously had a massive technology boom in all aspects since Victorian times, whether it be in entertainment or sport or household appliances. I mean, food is a big thing, isn't it? In terms of what were people eating, how were they storing it, and how were they cooking it back then?
Yeah, that's one of the things you have to think about if you were thinking, oh, gee, wouldn't it be nice to time travel back to the 19th century? And you're going, okay, and you're giving up absolutely everything you're familiar with. No crisps, no packaged biscuits, no mixes, no instant food, nothing that no freezer, for one thing, because they didn't have freezers. They did have refrigerators. And they had refrigerators as early as the 1860s. They did have refrigerators, which basically was a box that sat in your kitchen and you put a big block of ice in it. But freezers, they began to develop commercial freezers, I think around the 1870s, 1880s. That was primarily so that they could transport beef from, say, America or Australia to Britain, and as opposed to having to load up a ship full of live cows. they could actually start transporting beef. But, you don't have any frozen food. You can't just pull something out and thaw it. You're going to be cooking all day long. I mean, just everything is from scratch.
Yeah.
But they had a surprising variety of food in the Victorian era. And one of the reasons for that, of course, was that we're not used to having to worry about seasons anymore. I mean, if you want an apple, you can go to the store and you can buy an apple any time of the year. And that wasn't true in the 19th century, that you had to worry about when things were in season. And so you had to plan your menus around what was available, what was less expensive. Sometimes things that were in season would be more expensive because that's when everybody wanted them. And like around the holidays, turkeys and geese would be very expensive because everybody wanted a turkey or a goose for their Christmas dinner. And sometimes being in season meant things were inexpensive or the quality was better and so on. So just reading a lot of the women's magazines will have articles on, okay, it's May. What sorts of things would you be cooking in May or June? And it wasn't just a sort of a stodgy meat and potatoes diet, although I have to admit mutton was a really big part of it.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? That whole eating seasonally is now very fashionable, and people pay a lot of money to go to a fancy restaurant where everything on the menu is in season, whereas back then they didn't have a choice.
Yes, and in season and locally sourced, of course. That's very fashionable, too.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously, again, back then, way before supermarkets and things like that. So presumably because of lack of storage and things, people were, or the women primarily, I guess, were shopping every day in order to cook the dinner.
Very possibly. But again, you did have, again, your little refrigerator or ice box. So you could store things for several days. You could certainly store your milk and your butter and your eggs. You could store meats, fresh vegetables. You wouldn't really need to refrigerate. You could even, say, cook something and store your leftovers in the refrigerator. And I think it's in my book, there's a diagram from a sort of a standard ice box that shows where you might want to store some things closer to the ice and some things farther away. And you'd even kind of use the slush that melts down to keep your beverages cool down at the very bottom of your little refrigerator.
And in terms of entertainment, obviously many, many years before the television, even the radio, what about music?
Well, music, if you wanted it, if you were upper class or, well enough off, you could certainly go to a concert. Otherwise, you tended to do your own. And that's one of the reasons why, I mean, we look at the way Victorian women were brought up and think, they were trained in all these kind of strange things, like everyone learned how to play the piano, for example. But part of that was if you wanted music, you needed to know how to play the piano because you couldn't just tune in the radio. And they didn't have any idea the radio was coming. They thought that it was all going to be done by the telephone. And there's even, I just came across an article a few days ago that was showing, I think it was the Paris exhibition, and please don't ask me what year that was, but it was 1880 something. And one of the demonstrations was listening to opera by telephone. And the idea that, you would be able to pick up the telephone and get your broadcast, because I didn't really realize that radio was coming yet. But music, now, if you were working class, you'd probably get all the music you wanted just going out on the London streets, because there were performers out there on the streets doing all kinds of music and performances. But the upper middle class thought that was very low class, and you just didn't, people like us don't go listen to street performers.
No. It's fascinating, isn't it? And just the idea of listening to music and how that has changed so much over the years, just in our lifetime, all the different ways that we've listened to music and continue to do so is really interesting. And each form of new technology that comes about, now there's a lot of controversy with AI. Before that, I guess, video games. Before that, the internet. You know, each new thing that comes up at the time, people sort of freak out.
It's going to destroy us all. We're all going to turn into mindless vegetables.
Yeah.
And what's kind of funny is the Victorians felt that way about fiction.
Okay, I was going to ask what their thing was. Okay, fiction.
Yeah, their thing was fiction. They really had a lot of Victorians, and this was earlier on, that they were really afraid, especially that young women would be adversely affected because, of course, our brains were so delicate. And the excitement of fiction was, it would be more than we could handle. But also there was a certain amount of, if you weren't doing something useful, then there was something wrong. You needed to be doing something at all times. And fiction means you're just sitting around in a chair having a good time reading a book. So it's rather funny reading some of these articles about, well, is fiction, is there any good fiction? And of course, people then respond with, well, what about Dickens and what about Scott? And, well, yeah, we admit those are good, but all this new stuff, it's terrible, it's schlock, it's going to rot your brain. And of course, that was just voices crying in the wilderness, because the Victorians said, fiction is wonderful, we love it, we are going to read fiction every opportunity we can get. And that just made this huge publishing boom of books and magazines. Some of the fiction in Victorian times is really, really bad.
Oh, that's interesting. And of course, around those early years of fiction and for quite a few years after, a lot of books were banned, weren't they? If they seemed to have too much sex or violence or anything that was too controversial, even politically, people were, publishing houses or even whole countries were banning books.
Now, that I really can't speak to. I don't know how much of that was going on, but obviously a great deal of controversial stuff was being published, at least certainly in Britain. And I haven't read anything about Britain banning books, but I do think in other countries there was a lot more concern because, of course, there was a lot less of a kind of democratic government in a lot of other countries.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen any references thus far to books being banned in Britain or in America. And there was also, surprisingly, a strong self-publishing movement that you could basically go out and publish your own book and sell it yourself if you wanted to, which is kind of what we do today also.
Yeah. Yeah, no, a couple of books that spring to mind that were banned, I think, in the UK and I think the US at some point, books like Lady Chatterley's Lover and Lolita.
Oh, yes.
Those,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Lolita was quite a bit later, but yes.
Yeah.
Anything with any degree of actual sexual content would not have been considered acceptable.
No, absolutely.
Although there was certainly a very strong underground movement for publishing that sort of thing.
Yeah. So with all the research that you've done into Victorian Britain, is there a part of you that thinks it would have been enjoyable to be around then, or are you definitely thinking, I'm glad I was born when I was?
I tend to think I'm glad I was born when I was. It looks, I think some things would have been enjoyable, but if you weren't the right class, if you weren't the right color, life would not have been very enjoyable. And it's something that we take a lot for granted today, even though we talk a great deal about inequality and thinking, yeah, well, you haven't seen inequality until you go back to Victorian times. And a lot more. I mean, just one of the things that's also surprising in reading the Victorian literature is just the very casual bigotry and racism that you'll come across. And it's just people would publish articles about, how amusing it is what this ethnic group does or that ethnic group does. Aren't they funny because they're so different? And so that's something that kind of catches you up because, you talk about articles that would never get published today. Things like that would never get published today. And then it was just considered the norm to talk about people in that way. But also just thinking about, I love how Victorian fashions look, but who wants to wear a corset?
Yes, quite.
Not me. No, thank you. And just things like the medicines that are available today and the treatments that are available today and thinking, yes, I get sinus infections a lot. I'm glad I live in an era where if I need it, I have antibiotics and vaccinations and things like that. So...
yeah, definitely. And it seems to me, please correct me if I'm wrong, but was it that there was a lot less middle class people back then? It seems that people were either wealthy or they were poor, and there wasn't a lot in between. Is that right?
Actually, no. The middle class began growing immensely in the 19th century, and that's one of the things that drove a lot of the changes is in the early part of the Victorian era. So if you mark that as being 1837 when Queen Victoria came to the throne, you didn't have a lot of middle class, and that's true. And you had the big house. So if you were a servant, for example, you'd be working for one of the great big houses that had 30 or 40 or 50 servants. But by the 1850s, the middle class was really growing, and growing with part of it was there's more and more work at a middle class level because you're getting a lot more industry, manufacturing. And so if you think of the middle class, you're thinking about kind of the management level there as opposed to just the factory workers. You're having that middle strata of management types and bankers and lawyers and all that sort of thing. So the middle class was, by the late 19th century, the middle class was huge, and the middle class was your primary employer of servants.
Okay. Wow, amazing. So by the time Queen Victoria died in 1901, was Britain in a much better place financially, politically, than it was at the beginning of her reign?
That I really can't answer because, it's kind of like, what constitutes better? I mean, one of the things about the Victorian era is, I don't remember the exact number, but there was something like 38 or 40 wars. And I know there's a book out called Queen Victoria's Little Wars. And I mean, there's just little wars all over the place, Africa, India, throughout the world, mostly having to do with colonial issues. So, technologically, it was certainly a much more advanced place. And we talk about the technology, you were mentioning the technology boom that we've had, but the Victorians were living in a huge technology boom too. If you think about a world where suddenly you've introduced electricity.
Yeah.
And start to ask, okay, what can we do with this? And it was this huge, they thought of themselves as being incredibly modern compared to everything that had gone before, and they were the scientific and discovering and inventing era. So, there's all different ways of looking at better or worse.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Good point. Well, it's a fascinating subject, and if people want to find out more, they should definitely get a copy of your book. It's called How to Survive in Victorian Britain. It's available on our website, TRE.radio, and it's by Moira Allen, who we've been chatting with today. Moira, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.